Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question based on our Bible reading for that day. This week our reading is centered around the book of 1 Thessalonians. Today I'm joined by Jay Rivenbark and Zack Unkenholz, and our question is from chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. But since this is Monday, let me give the theme and a little bit of background. So 1 Thessalonians, the theme is encouragement and concern for the church. So it's twofold. And it's very likely that this will be, we will combine 1st and 2nd Thessalonians for a sermon for a specific reason. There's a probability we will, because we have something else going on. But 1st Thessalonians is this letter written by the Apostle Paul to the church at Thessalonica, and the central theme is encouragement and concern for the church. He expresses his joy and gratitude for the faithfulness of the Thessalonian believers, and he wants to encourage them to grow in their faith. He addresses some areas where they need correction and instruction, such as sexual purity and the importance of hard work. But throughout the letter, he emphasizes the importance of and the anticipation of Christ's return, and he encourages the Thessalonians to comfort and encourage one another in this hope. So that's kind of the background, and our reading today in chapter 2, I want to center on verse 9 specifically. He says, "Don't you remember, dear brothers and sisters, how hard we worked among you? Night and day we toiled to earn a living so that we would not be a burden to any of you as we preached God's good news to you." So what we know about Paul, or we think based on all of the reading we can put together, is that most likely he was a tent maker. That was his trade. There's a couple of other things that we can get out of this. One, he says, we didn't want to be a burden on you, which signifies that they were paying or giving, or it was a paid job that as a pastor, apostle, teacher, whatever, the teachers that came through. And you will see that in some of his other writings. But he here says, I worked day and night, or we worked day and night, so you didn't have to give to us, so we weren't a burden to you. Today we would call it bi-vocational ministry. Maybe that there's lots of different names that it could go by. Do bivocational ministers have any advantages or disadvantages over someone who only is a vocational ministry?
Well, I think if you're bivocational, you're having opportunity to be with people outside the church potentially. You have the benefit for the church is that it can be less of a burden on a church, especially if a new church or a church is building up. But I think that the advantage of having someone who is vocational or not bivocational is that you have a lot more time that you can dedicate to the church and to the people, and that can be your sole focus. And so I think that there are pros and cons to both. But if your church, I feel like if you can afford to have someone whose sole job is to support the church and to be there just for the church, I think that can outweigh the benefits of having someone who's bivocational. But I don't know, maybe you have a different thought, Jay.
Now, I would agree that one of the advantages of bivocational ministry would be that I think you have a tendency perhaps maybe to stay more connected to realities of the world around you, perhaps. It would be easy to get in a vacuum as full-time where it's all church, all inside church, where your focus and perspective may not be quite where it needs to be. One of the advantages, I wouldn't think this happens all the time, but I'm sure it happens some of the time, whereas a bivocational minister, where you're not solely dependent on a church for your income, then you might be emboldened or equipped to do what needs to be done or say what needs to be said, whereas where some places would control and manipulate what a person does because literally they own them in that sense financially. So
Mhm.
so there's a risk of that. I think the biggest downside, as Zach mentioned, is the lack of time to pour into people. Whereas a full-time minister would be able to give much more. In the verse before you started reading, he talks about we gave you not only the good news, but our very lives. We shared our lives together. And I think that is the biggest single advantage of full-time ministry, is that you're able on a broader scale to give yourself in relationship not only to God but to other people too.
Maybe.
Should be.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Now, I with that comment, I have seen instances of, quote, full-time ministry where it was the full-time devotion maybe to golf or recreation rather than to people. So that can be misused too, but there's an opportunity for it
Yeah.
to pour into and develop relationships.
We call that semi-vocational.
Occasional vocational.
So I think there are advantages and disadvantages.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the advantages have been covered. I from my perspective, I have seen churches hold pastors hostage over my lifetime over money.
Mm-hmm.
And they felt like they had to do certain things because of certain givers, and they had to do certain things so that they could have a salary. And I recall having a conversation with a missionary, and he had come to stay here, visit with us, and he stayed with a church member in a house that would look like a mansion from where he was. It wasn't. We wouldn't consider it that, but it was a nice house on the water. And he said, how do you deal with that? And I said, I don't think nothing about it. Like, I don't care what they give. They got to give a lot to outgive me because, I work. I own my own business at the time. I said I give almost everything I earn back to the church from the business. And so I don't feel any pressure. Because he said, do you feel pressure, for people? I feel zero. I still feel zero pressure. I just don't think that way. Now, some of that is also my personality makeup too. So, I mean, if I was broke, I could care less. That would be that's still the same thing. But so I do think it emboldens pastors at times, or I think it causes pastors to. A fully vocational pastor causes them to pull back maybe some of the boldness. I think fully vocational pastors can live in a bubble. They go to the seminary, of which they know the Word of God. I've never questioned somebody coming out of seminary. I may not agree with their theology, but they knew the Bible. And then they go directly into vocational ministry, and they're oblivious to things of the world, what people are dealing with. And one of the things I've always said is one of the things business does is it puts me in, I have to deal with some rough characters. You worked as a law enforcement officer and then a federal marshal for a while after you were pastoring, and would see a lot of things, that the average pastor just wouldn't see in the course of life. And it's easy to live in a bubble and think, everything is in this vacuum, as you say. The downside of it, so I don't, it's not the relationships so much that I think suffer, even though that can be part of it, because you can go back to the book of Acts and you find the apostles saying, find somebody else to serve tables. We need to be devoting our time to studying God's word and pray. Those are the two things that we need to spend our time doing. So I've seen people in vocational ministry, even full-time vocational ministry, extract themselves from relationships. um, my experience is it is a distraction, a positive distraction and a negative distraction. It can clutter your mind, your heart, and your soul, you know, um, to the point that it can affect your ability to lead, your ability to care for somebody. Um, it can at times put you at odds with them if your business particularly does business with their business. You know, if you, um, uh, I, I was in a conversation just last week that this person that I respect highly, he said, my experience today is that men and women who are able to find other avenues, not just for money, but for commerce in general, are more effective leaders than ones who are not. Because if you think about it, um, I, I read an article the other day about T.D. Jakes, and I forget, he owns like 8 or 10 separate companies, complete, production companies, publishing companies, all of these things. And so we don't think of those people as bivocational, but they are. I mean, they're doing a lot of other things, not just ministry. And it may be extensions or additional lanes to what they're already doing. Uh, book writing, for example, when you write a book, the people you deal with at the publishing company, going on a book tour, and sometimes that turns into the most profitable piece of what they do. Rick Warren is an example of that. He probably is the most successful author that I can think of who was a pastor, but lots of them have made lots of money. They may be songwriters, Stephen Furtick, for example, makes a lot of money off of song royalties because a lot of the songs we sing are songs he was a co-writer to. And we don't think of those as bivocational, but they are other vocations. When you start dealing with publishing companies and recording companies and, production companies for movies, it becomes a lot more complicated, and you have to use a different set. One of the greatest things that I think it brings to the table is their ability to see whether we like this or not, the business side of the church. Because there's a business side to this, and I know some pastors who are clueless about a budget, vision.
Yeah, I would agree with that. To your earlier statement, that as I think through examples, that people who are extended in other areas make a better leader even within the church. Question I would ask is, do you think congregations who have bivocational pastors, do you think they have any less expectations of those pastors, or they have the same?
No.
I don't think so either. I think they have the absolute same expectations of them.
They're some of the hardest worked people.
I would agree.
In the world. I have not found any less expectations. Let me put it that way. And here even at our church, this size of our church would normally, growing up, this would have been a church where you didn't do anything else. This was all you did. But when you I think about even people like Charles Stanley. The In Touch ministry still continues on, even though they have a new pastor for the church. It's separately operated nonprofit, but they've got a couple hundred employees. I mean, that's a large organization. That is, Liberty University, Jerry Falwell. It's not under his control anymore. He's dead, but he pastored and was the chancellor or president of the college. So you find that people who are able to expand their horizons often are more effective. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back tomorrow as we continue our conversation around the book of 1 Thessalonians.